Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. And on this episode today, let's talk about hook sets and why you might not be getting good solid hook sets and getting those fish in the boat as often as you'd like. This is something that we've all battled with. I've made all the mistakes over the years and have lost a lot of fish because of those mistakes. And, it's just a fact. You're going to lose some fish in this sport. Even if you do everything 100% perfect, you're going to lose some fish. That's just how it is. But there are a lot of things that you can do to limit the amount of fish that you lose and the amount of fish that you ultimately hook well and get in the boat. And most of the time when I see people making mistakes, it has to do with the equipment that they're using. Their rod, the line that they're using, the hooks that they're using, and also the baits that they're using. So getting one of those things wrong and using one of the wrong components in the system, even just one, can really be the difference between getting a good hook set and losing that fish. And so I kind of want to share with you guys some of the principles that I use and some of the advice that I have on those different types of tackle in your system and how they relate to hook sets. So as I mentioned, hooks, line, and rods are really the main components that I think really affect your ability to set the hook. And when it comes to rods and line, it's usually about leverage, being able to get slack out of the line very quick, and also paying attention to the amount of stretch that you have in those. So we'll talk about those in a minute, but I do want to talk about hooks first off, because hooks are very, very important. We're going to assume that all the hooks that I'm talking about right now are very, very sharp. That is kind of the key component. If you're not using sharp hooks, you're definitely not going to get a good solid hook set. If you have a bait that, maybe you're throwing a chatterbait and for some reason you haven't checked the hook point in a while, but you miss a few fish, oftentimes you'll look at that hook point and it's rolled over or something like that, and that's why you're missing those fish. So having good sharp hooks is absolutely the number one thing, but we're not going to be talking too much about that. Really what we're going to be talking about is, first off, the shape of the hook in relation to the baits that you're going to be using. And I'm mostly talking about, the soft plastics here. So, I use a lot of Z-Man Elastec plastics. Those are pretty special because they compress a lot. And so I can kind of use, smaller hooks in general for those baits because they don't gob up on the hook as much and prohibit me from getting a good solid hook set. But especially with traditional plastics, and also with Elastec baits and those super plastics, it's really important to pay attention to the gap on your hook. So my general rule is that I want my hook gap to be about twice as big as the width of the bait that I'm using. So for instance, if I'm using like a Z-Man Goat, that's a fairly wide bait. I want the hook that I'm using to be twice as wide as far as the gap. So that's why EWGs are really important for those wide-bodied creature baits, is because you have enough gap to allow that bait to kind of get out of the way, to allow the hook point and the gap to do what it needs to do to, penetrate that fish's mouth and then lock in and allow you to get that fish in the boat. So with thinner baits, you can get away with using a narrower gap. So just a regular offset shank hook, you can get away with that with those thinner baits. But the general rule is that you want a hook gap that is about twice as big as the bait that you're using. Okay, and going bigger when it comes to your hook, as far as like the actual size of the hook, is not always better. In fact, this is a lesson that I learned a long time ago when I was having some trouble with straight shank hooks and flipping. I was losing a ton of fish. I mean, an absolute ton. I've lost hundreds of thousands of dollars fishing straight shank hooks for flipping and pitching, and that's not an exaggeration. Like, lost the Toyota or the TBF National Championship, which had a $100,000 grand prize, by 4 ounces, and lost a ton of fish in that tournament, especially the second day when I only came in with 4 fish. So, but that was, I'm just mentioning that because I had a couple years where I was experimenting with different hook sizes, and I even used a 7/0 straight shank flipping hook in a cricket, a little, cricket punching bait back in the day, very, very small bait. And it looked crazy because this giant shark hook of a flipping hook was in this tiny, tiny little bait. It barely fit in the nose of that bait when I hooked it back into the plastic. And I actually had a worse hooking percentage with that because what I learned was the bigger the hook, the more likely when the fish chomps down on it that it rotates sideways and slips out of the mouth a lot easier. A smaller hook, comparatively, will actually stay straight up and down a little bit more when the fish goes to crush that bait. It'll tend to hide down in their jaw and stick straight up. And so the hooking percentage is actually pretty good with smaller hooks. That's why, like, for most of my flipping situations, I'm going to be using a 4/0 EWG nowadays. 4/0 is just a really good size for most creature baits. 5/0 is a little bit big, but I feel like my hooking percentage is really, really good with a 4/0. So when it comes to the size gap and also the size of the hook, those are two very, very important factors that if you find that you're missing a lot of fish, that could be an issue. Another issue that I see people make a lot of mistakes with, and I've made the same mistake, is not paying attention to the wire diameter, the size of the wire that the hook is actually made out of in relation to other components in their system. So for instance, I've seen people use heavy tackle, flipping stick, real heavy line, maybe even braided line with a light wire hook, okay? Every single company, I work with Hayabusa. They make a lot of different hooks, and a lot of their hooks come in, both light wire sizes and heavy duty sizes. My favorite hook is the WRM 959, but it also comes in a 956, which is way lighter wire. Okay, so when I'm fishing with this lighter wire version, I definitely want to pay attention to the line size and the type of rod that I'm going to be using, because I don't want to overpower that hook. But one thing that I think is equally important, because if you overpower your hook, you're more than likely going to straighten out that hook, especially in heavy cover. But one thing that I see people make a big mistake with is they start using lighter tackle, but they're using a heavy wire hook. When you have a heavy wire hook like the Hayabusa 959, you need way more force to be able to get that hook point and that thicker, denser, metal through that fish's mouth. So it takes a lot more force when you set the hook to be able to get that hook point through that fish's mouth, just because the diameter of the wire is bigger in general. So it's still a sharp hook. It just is a bigger hook to get through cartilage, muscle, and bone. And so you need to make sure that you're using a comparatively heavy setup. So when I'm fishing a 959, I'm generally not fishing anything below 17-pound test as far as fluorocarbon, and up to 25-pound test fluorocarbon, and up to 65-pound braid. And so it's really important to remember that. And I usually use a medium heavy or heavy action rod for those heavier gauge wires. So I see a lot of people, they'll make a long cast with a long stretchy nylon line, a light whippy rod, but they have a heavy duty hook on the other end. And they're wondering why they're not getting a good hook set and getting fish to the boat or to the bank. And that's more than likely why, is because you're not pairing the right hook with the other components in your tackle system. All right, so that is, those are some of the main factors when it comes to choosing the right hooks for the situation. Same thing goes for finesse hooks too. I mean, I mentioned that Hayabusa makes a lot of different hooks in different versions, in different strengths. One of my favorite drop shot hooks is the 132, the DSR 132. It comes in a heavy duty version. I'm not going to be using the heavy duty version with 6-pound test. I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to be using this one for 6-pound tests, but this one, I might be using 12 or 14-pound tests or something like that. And I need to have the heavier line, the heavier tackle to get that hook point through the fish's mouth. The next component in the system that I think is really important, and I see a lot of mistakes being made with, is the fishing line. And when it comes to fishing line and how it relates to good hook sets, really I think the biggest factor is stretch. Stretch is something that you have to deal with nylon lines, especially. Braided lines, really, I mean, I'm sure that they've got some amount of stretch, but it's so minimal that it's really virtually no stretch at all. I use a braided line in Alaska for fish down in 2,200 feet of water, and I can feel the bite because there's no stretch involved. For black cod down there and halibut, you can feel everything. I can feel if you still have bait without reeling in the bait in 300 foot of water. I can tell you that whether or not you have bait because it doesn't have any stretch and it's really, really sensitive. So braid is a really, really good line for when you're making very, very long casts, especially in heavy cover like vegetation. Because it doesn't have any stretch, and it doesn't take a lot for you to when you set the hook to pull all that slack out and to drive that hook point home. So braid is really, really good for long casts because you don't have the stretch. And also, just close quarters, flipping, pitching, and punching, braid is really important. But once you start getting into nylon lines like fluorocarbon and monofilament, especially monofilament, monofilament has the most stretch of any type of line. It's like a rubber band. If you've ever tried to fish a monofilament on a whippy, like fiberglass rod, it's just mind-blowing that people could actually fish with that fishing line and the type of rods that they used to have and still drive a Texas rig worm home into the fish's mouth. Blows my mind. You'd have to really start getting that stretch out with the reel first and then set the hook to be able to pick up all that slack and get all that stretch out. So kudos to everybody back in the day that was fishing monofilament, fiberglass, or composite rods and using those hooks that weren't quite as sharp back in the day and still getting those fish in the boat. Pretty darn impressive. But monofilament, fluorocarbon, they have stretch, which isn't inherently a bad thing, okay? For a lot of different baits like crankbaits or reaction baits like chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, topwaters, anything that has an exposed hook that's kind of a moving bait, stretch can be a very, very beneficial thing because you don't want to pull the bait away from the fish before it engulfs it, and it helps you fight the fish. However, stretch can work against you in situations where you're making very long casts. And just like, I was talking about with the braid being very, very good for long casts and heavy cover, monofilament and fluorocarbon can be a little bit problematic with extra long casts because you have extra stretch and it's going to take more force. Now, that doesn't mean that they're bad choices. It just means that you're going to have to compensate with one of the other components. Maybe use a smaller wire size hook. Maybe you need to use a longer, stiffer rod to get more leverage and to pull more slack out and get that stretch out. So you may need to compensate a little bit if you feel like you're going to get more bites using a line like fluorocarbon on a long cast. And I do this very often because fluorocarbon is a very, very important type of line for most of the bass fishing techniques that we use nowadays. So I'm not going to sacrifice my fluorocarbon just because it has a little bit of stretch. And the good thing about fluorocarbon is that it has a considerably less stretch than monofilament. it definitely has more than braid, but it has less stretch than monofilament. So it kind of reaches that like perfect, three bears zone, that Goldilocks zone where it's just like the perfect amount of stretch. But pay attention to that. If you feel it when you're setting the hook, like you're just not feeling like you're getting to, you're not feeling the full weight of the fish quick enough, you may be experiencing a lot of stretch, and that may be part of the problem. And you might need to compensate with other tackle or completely change to braid to combat the stretch. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to your nylon lines, fluorocarbon, monofilament, when it relates to stretch, is that, and I don't have any data on this. This is just from my personal experience and how it feels when I'm fishing it. But I believe that the lighter the pound test, so the smaller the line, the smaller diameter, the more stretch you're going to have. So for instance, with lighter line, you're going to have to use a very, very light wire hook. That's why you see guys using a very, very light wire, like drop shot hook with like 4 or 6 pound test, is because you're just not going to be able to generate the amount of force necessary to get a heavy duty hook, through the cartilage and bone in a fish's mouth, without risking breaking the line. So, or having too much stretch. So if you're using lighter line, you got to use lighter wire hooks, okay, to be able to get a good hook set. But like 20 pound test fluorocarbon, you can use the strongest hook in your tackle box and still get a good solid hook set. And I just feel like there's less stretch when you have a heavier line. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not scientific based, it's just based on my own experience with that tackle. So the next thing you want to pay attention to is the rod that you're using. Okay, again, you're kind of seeing a common thread throughout this video is if you have slack in your line, or your line is too spongy, there's too much give in the whole system, that's going to be a problem with hook sets, especially if you're fishing baits that have hooks that are exposed, using a Texas rig or something like that, or behind a big brush guard or something like that. So having the right rod is really important. When you're using lighter line or lighter wire hooks, you can go to a medium or medium light, or just a softer action rod. Okay, but when you're talking about lines that are heavier, you're using heavier gauge wire hooks, you need to be using something that has a little bit stiffer backbone, and something that has a faster action to it. Okay, and action and power are something that gets confused a lot. So power is the amount of force that it takes to bend a rod. Action is actually how quickly or where the rod bends. Okay, when it does bend, the faster the action, the more it just bends towards the tip. The slower the action, the more it bends, down closer to the middle or closer to the handle, that sort of thing. So if I'm using Texas rigs, heavier line, heavier wire hooks, that's when I want a faster action and a heavier power. Usually I like medium heavy or heavy for the heavier tackle. But if I'm using finesse techniques or I've got exposed hooks, that's when I can go down to like a medium action or moderate fast action, something like that, and medium power, something in that range. Another thing when it comes to rods that you need to pay attention to is the leverage that you get with rods. Okay, a 6.5 foot rod has way less leverage than this one right here, a 7.3 rod. Okay, so if you're having a hard time getting a good solid hook set on a long cast and you're fishing a 6.5 foot rod, I don't know what to tell you. You're going to have a hard time getting all the slack out and getting a good solid hook set before you pull that bait out of that fish's mouth with that short of a rod. A short rod to me is a close target, like very short presentation type of rod. if I'm going to be making long casts in deep water, especially with fluorocarbon line, I want a 7.3 to 7.6 action rod, or a 7.6 foot rod to really be able to get that slack out and get extra leverage. Okay, so that's another thing to think about. But anyways, guys, just wanted to wrap on some of the different component factors that go into whether or not you can get a good solid hook set. It's super, super important to choose the right tackle for the situation, and all of the components of your system need to work together. So anyways, guys, if you have any questions, drop a comment below. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and make sure you trust the process. And I'm going to see you out on the water. Take care.